Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Bloomsbury Baptist Church here in London. I'd like to welcome you all here for the Imperialism on Trial and Free Julian Assange event. I would like to thank RT, Russia Today, and Rupley TV for live streaming this event, and also to welcome all the online viewers from around the world who will be watching this event tonight. We are all very saddened but not surprised by today's verdict at the Southwark Crown Court. I spoke with a member of WikiLeaks who described today's verdict as worse than bad. So we're gathered here tonight in support of Julian, not only on a human level, but on a wider level concerning human rights and freedom of the press. I asked Mairead Maguire, the Irish Nobel Peace Prize winner, to speak, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. But she has shared with me her recent plea to the UK Home Office for a visit to Julian. You will all have been given a copy of this, and Mairead wished me to read it out, so I'll read out segments of her appeal to the British Home Office. Thursday, 11th April, will go down in history as a dark day for rights of humanity when Julian Assange, a brave and good man, was arrested by British Metropolitan Police, forcibly removed without prior warning in a style befitting of a war criminal from the Ecuadorian embassy and bundled into a police van. It is a sad time when the UK government, at the behest of the United States government, arrested Julian Assange, a symbol of freedom of speech, as publisher of WikiLeaks. And a world leader and the mainstream media remain silent on the fact that he is an innocent man until proven guilty, while the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention defines him as innocent. The decision of President Lenin Moreno of Ecuador, who under financial pressure from the US has withdrawn asylum to WikiLeaks founder, it is further example that the United States global currency monopoly pressurizing other countries to do their bidding or face the financial and possible violent consequences for disobedience. Julian Assange has taken asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy 7 years ago precisely because he foresaw that the US would demand his extradition to face a grand jury in the US for mass murders carried out not by him, but by US and NATO forces and concealed from the public. Mairead goes on, I nominated Julian Assange on the 8th of January 2019 for the Nobel Peace Prize. I issued a press release hoping to bring attention to the nomination, which seemed to have been widely ignored by Western media. By Julian's courageous actions and others like him, we could see full well the atrocities of war. The reason of the files brought to our doors, the atrocities our government carried out through media. It is my strong belief that this is the true essence of an activist, and it is my great shame I live in an era where people like Julian Assange, Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and others are willing to open our eyes to the atrocities of war, and they are haunted like animals by governments, punished and silenced. Therefore, I believe the British government should oppose the extradition of Assange, as it sets a dangerous precedent for journalism, whistleblowers and other sources of truth the US may wish to pressure in the future. The man is paying a high price to end war and for peace and non-violence, and we should all remember that. So it's with that now that I would like to hand over to our host and also speaker of tonight, Mr. George Galloway.
Don't tell him your name, Pike. Private Pike, Defence Secretary of the United Kingdom, is on his way to jail. He must now face charges under the Official Secrets Act, having betrayed our country's national security in plain sight didn't have the guts to own up to it, forced the Prime Minister to hold an official inquiry which has found that our Defence Secretary leaked secrets from a meeting of the National Security Council, and the Prime Minister has sent him a letter ordering him to demit office, as she no longer has any confidence in him. So I have an idea. A prisoner swap. Let's open the gates of Belmarsh Prison, let Julian Assange out, and bang Gavin Williamson in the cell that Julian demits. Julian was, of course, a more honourable prisoner than Private Pike could ever be. After all, Private Pike leaked our secrets for personal advancement. And one could say, insofar as the wages of sin of being Prime Minister are greater than the Defence Secretary, for personal enrichment. Julian Assange told the truth to us, not for personal interest, not for personal enrichment, but for our enrichment, our interests. Julian Assange told the truth to us, for us, and he accrued no conceivable advantage in so doing. Indeed, he has suffered mightily, bearing that cross of being a truth teller down all these years of incarceration, and I would argue torture, at the hands of the besieging British government and their American masters. Julian Assange bears the scars of being a truth teller. I have the privilege, as several do on this platform, of describing Julian Assange as my friend. I knew him when he was young and fresh and healthy and vibrant. And I have to tell you, when I saw him dragged out of that embassy, as Greg Sharkey said, in the manner befitting of a war criminal, I wept bitter tears for what had become of Julian Assange. And I met a lady today, she may be here, in a shopping mall in southwest London. An ordinary woman, not political at all, wasn't even sure if I was me. And she told me that she had watched what I'd said outside the grim prison walls of Belmarsh, and that she too had cried, and that she thought of Julian Assange every day. The ladies here, God bless you and thank you for coming. That she thought of Julian Assange every day. That's the impact of what has happened in the hearts of ordinary people who just know that there's something wrong here. The man that told the truth about the war crimes is in prison, and the men that carried out the war crimes are counting their millions that they have made out of those crimes. It's just not right, is it? It's just not right. That lady knew that it's just not right. Dare I say, it's just not British. It's not fair. It's not just. And we demand that the British government cease and desist from their efforts to send Julian Assange to the torture chambers of the United States injustice system, because that's what they are planning to do. But there's many a slip, twixt cup and lip, and there's more than one breaking story today. Let me tell you that in the last hour, it has been announced that there will be a parliamentary by-election in the Peterborough constituency, triggered by a recall petition. And so I can announce to you, you're the first to know, I will be a candidate in that by-election. And one of my candidate descriptions will be Free Julian Assange. Free Julian Assange. We shouldn't chant in a holy place, but I take your point. We have assembled here a fine panel of speakers. I will come back to the microphone in introducing them. I may add a few words here and there, but they can speak for themselves. Greg, you've taken my list. Our first speaker needs little introduction, at least if you listen to my radio show. She's a hero herself. She's someone from within the deep state itself. She's someone who was charged with our national security. And by the way, if she'd done what Gavin Williamson had done, she'd already be in jail these past years. But she has never done that. She left the security services because she believes in our national security and not in its prostitution for other people's national interests. She's a whistleblower, like Julian Assange, although within the law. And you'll see her on our Sputnik show on RT on Saturday. Please welcome the wonderful Annie Machen.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, George. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight. It's an amazing turnout in support of someone who has displayed exemplary vision and exemplary courage in furthering freedom around the world, and that is Julian Assange. What I want to talk about tonight is my experience, partly of working with WikiLeaks with Julian, but also of the bigger picture in terms of what he's facing, what will happen, what is the definition, the legalities, and all that sort of stuff. So my background is indeed MI5. I was an intelligence officer way back in the early 1990s for 6 years, before resigning with my former partner and my colleague, a man called David Shaler, who became quite a notorious whistleblower in the late 1990s. And we ended up paying a very high price, he particularly. We ended up going on the run literally around Europe in the late 1990s. We had to live in hiding for a year in France, and we had to live in exile in France for another 2 years. And he went to prison twice for exposing the crimes of the spies. We're not talking about official secrets here. We are talking about unofficial secrets when the spies break the law. And they can do it very easily, because there is no meaningful oversight over what our intelligence agencies do. Do not believe the government when they say there is not. Because even the government doesn't know. The spies can lie to them too. So David went to prison twice for exposing crimes, up to and including an illegal assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya back in 1996, where MI6, our James Bond wing of British intelligence, funded a known branch of Al-Qaeda to illegally assassinate a foreign head of state. You can't get much more illegal than that. And the attack manifestly went wrong because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated in 2011 by precisely the same characters, funded by precisely the same intelligence agencies. But innocent people died in the 1996 attack, and David reported that, and David went to prison. In fact, David ended up not only in prison in Paris when the British government failed to extradite him for a breach of the Official Secrets Act in 1998, he also ended up in Belmarsh prison in 2002, which is precisely where Julian Assange is currently languishing. And it is a terrifying prison. That is where all the high security prisoners go. That's where the AAA category terrorist prisoners go. And David told me he survived by telling his fellow prisoners that he'd been taught how to kill people with his bare hands in MI5. That's how he survived there. It is violent, it is terrifying. And that's where Julian is currently languishing. The other point I want to make as well from those whistleblowing years is that David took proof from MI5 to establish his bona fides, to say, here are the documents establishing what I'm discussing. And he gave them to the newspaper in 1997 in order to stand up the stories that they broke. Now, of course, this is pre-widespread internet. I mean, it's like going back to the Jurassic era. And the newspaper insisted on keeping the copies of the documents. And then, of course, once the story broke, the Metropolitan Police went crashing in to the newspaper and demanded the documents back out of the newspaper's safe. So David lost all proof of what he was trying to establish in the public interest. So fast forward about a decade. Come 2009, I'm floating around in various tech hacktivist geek circles across Europe, and I end up in a big Dutch hacktivist festival called HA. Not AHA, HA. And someone pointed out to me a man called Julian Assange and said, he's really interesting. He's recently set up an organization called WikiLeaks, which you might think is important. And when they explained what the point was, where whistleblowers and leakers could send information secretly to an organization called WikiLeaks, where that information would be stored, where the whistleblower didn't necessarily have to immediately identify themselves and face the full pushback against from the state, where that they could prove what they were saying. I thought this is a really interesting concept. And the fact that Julian Assange came from the cypherpunk movement, where there was a movement from the 1990s. He had the really good technical nous to protect any source that wanted to donate information to him. I thought this is a wonderful mechanism. I wish it had existed back in the 1990s when David and I were trying to blow the whistle about MI5. So I met Julian at that event, and I stayed vaguely in contact with him over the years. And I have nothing but appreciation and awe for his courage in what he has done, not only to expose so much crucial information, not just about the American government, but about corporations and governments and war crimes around the planet over the last decade. I have nothing but admiration for what he personally has put up with when it was manifestly obvious back in 2011 or 12, whenever it was, when this threat about, rape allegations in Sweden came up, when he had been warned there would be some CIA sting operation against him, when he knew what the case would be against him, he still went ahead, and his staff as well, let's not forget them, still went ahead and continued to publish information that is very much in the public interest. I would like to say as well very clearly that that system has never failed. No source has ever been identified because of a technical failure. This is the coverage, this is the protection that Julian Assange, with his vision of WikiLeaks, has provided to whistleblowers around the world. Now, why do I think this is important? Because of my background, and because I can't help trying to organise and help people, I've been involved with a number of other organisations over the years, whistleblower organisations, and most notably organisations like the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity in America and the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence, who give an award every year to those who indeed display integrity and intelligence. And awards have gone to, of course, Julian, and of course people like Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Thomas Drake, Bill Binney, Craig Murray, former ambassador of the UK, who exposed torture and got vilified for it. Many, many, many key whistleblowers have been honoured and supported by these groups. And we put out a memorandum to the UK government and to the US government only yesterday, saying that not only is what they are doing to Julian Assange going to have a chilling effect on the media, of course we know that, and I'm sure many of my fellow speakers are going to be speaking to that, but also that it is a chilling effect to future whistleblowers as well. And I want to be very clear about this. Julian Assange is not a whistleblower. He is a publisher, a high-tech publisher, a new model publisher who has broken the old mould of the old legacy media. And I think that goes partly to explain why the old legacy media has attacked him over the last few years too. They see him and this new model as a threat. And I have to say, whatever happens to Julian, I really hope the worst doesn't happen to Julian. The new model is out there. The genie is out of the bottle. The old media cannot put that genie back in the bottle, and the governments cannot control it either. So let's hope for more whistleblowers. Having said that, just to update on what the legal situation is in this country, we are now facing a position where advice has been drawn up by the Law Commission for the government to consolidate, as they call it, the official secrecy laws in the UK. So at the moment, if you are an intelligence whistleblower, you face 2 years in prison. If you are a journalist covering and breaking the news of the story provided by that intelligence whistleblower, you potentially face 2 years in prison. If you are republishing something that is already in the public domain, you are legally allowed to do so. That comes out of the Peter Wright spycatcher ruling from back in the 1980s. What the Law Commission is now proposing to the government is to consolidate and tighten up our secrecy laws in this country. And what they are proposing is that whistleblowers coming out of the intelligence agency, the military, and central government will now face 14 years in prison with no legal defence. Journalists reporting this information will now face 14 years with only no damage defence. And the prior publication of information will no longer be a defence under law if you reprint something. Now, this is appalling because the 14 years in prison is something that traitors face when they betray their country, not whistleblowers and not journalists. So the pushback, even in this country, is appalling. And the pusillanimous attitude taken by our government in not protecting someone like Julian Assange, who is a publisher, is appalling. The craven attitude of our mainstream media in this country, who are not laying out the facts about what Julian has achieved, is bloody appalling. And that's what we're facing at the moment. I speak a lot. For obvious reasons, I have been very concerned about my personal privacy being snooped on, because I am the gamekeeper indeed turned poacher. I know what the spies can do to follow you. So I've been speaking out about privacy and about whistleblowing for many, many years now. What I see now very clearly is a ghastly confluence of the corporate and the state. Now, if I were a psychiatrist, I would be aware of something they call the dark triad, which is the worst possible combination of psychiatric, sociopathic aspects in one human being. And in fact, they confluence very well in James Bond, if you're interested. The first one being Machiavellianism, the second one being narcissism, and the third one being psychopathy. It's a nasty combination. What I would say is what we're looking at the moment in what's going on in terms of our internet freedoms, I also would describe as the dark triad. So we're looking at three forces of darkness coming down to clamp down and prevent the future development of our internet freedoms. First of all, we're seeing the corporate side of things, be it big social media watching everything we do, be it copyright laws, intellectual property right laws, which we're seeing being pushed further and further even within the EU legislation recently. So that's the business side of things. Of course, there is a crackdown on hackers, criminals as they want to call them, or hacktivists, as many of us like to call them. And also, of course, there's what the spies do, which has been laid bare in all its gory detail ever since Edward Snowden went public, with a whole slew of information coming out about precisely how complicit the corporations were, and also how much the spies are doing to us and how they can frame people. What we've also seen as well, and I would recommend if you're not familiar with this, is a WikiLeaks disclosure a couple of years ago called Vault 7. And this was very interesting because it showed that the CIA had developed tools to make it look as if something were hacked. Then it could be made to appear as if it were hacked by the Russian government or by the Chinese government. There are specific programs along these lines. So we have a situation now where what on earth can we believe on the internet? We are told there is fake news everywhere. We are told there are laws being put in place to crunch down on fake news, but those laws are being used to crunch down on freedom of expression as well. And indeed, just one final point, what we're looking at with what is happening is Julian Assange, a high-tech publisher, being crushed by these ridiculous charges and faced with God knows what in the US if he is extradited. And we only have one charge. We know that there's been a secret grand jury convened for years, pulling together all sorts of other charges, potentially under the Espionage Act. What we are looking at is the very fulcrum that will kill our freedom on the internet, all of us, not just for publishers, not just for journalists. It could disappear, any of us. We will lose our freedom of expression. So the key final point here is the irony. Do you remember during the whole Russiagate hysteria post-Trump election, we had a situation where there was something called the Dirty Dossier, pulled together by a former MI6 intelligence officer, Christopher Steele. Now, that turned out to be a bunch of rubbish, but he was sued in an American court by 3 of the Russian oligarchs he had traduced in this Dirty Dossier. And the judge in that case said very clearly in his final judgment, his final ruling at the end of that case, Christopher Steele, even though he is British, even though he is resident in Britain, is deserving of the First Amendment rights under the US Constitution, which means the right to freedom of expression, because what he did was in the public good. And yet now we see the point where someone like Julian Assange, an Australian living in Britain, is already explicitly denied, apparently, his right to the First Amendment, his right to freedom of expression, if he goes to the States. How is that justice? Well, we know there's no justice in this. This is a political act. But there are so many dark, swirling circles under what appears to be a fairly simple case of extradition. And all I can say is, if we do not stand up for WikiLeaks, if we do not stand up for Julian Assange, a man who was a visionary, a man who has displayed exemplary courage and exemplary fortitude over the last few years, we do not deserve to live in a democracy. We need to fight and we need to support him. Otherwise, we will all lose our freedoms. Thank you very much.
We're privileged, unexpectedly, to be able to welcome as the next speaker, the head of WikiLeaks. Christian, welcome to the meeting.
Thank you, George. Thank you all. And I'm happy to be here. It's been a very busy day. My mind is full of anger, actually, after today's sentencing that you've all heard of. It was a great shock to be in court today and observing a judge basically dismissing every mitigating and strong evidence in support of Julian Assange. The judge who obviously had pre-written the decision before she heard the counter-argument, it was quite obvious, and then giving Julian Assange, well, de facto, the maximum sentence of a year imprisonment minus 2 weeks. This is absurd. This is no justice. This is a vindictive and a political decision. And my God, there was a question going through my mind. Will we ever have any justice? Will Julian Assange have any justice in the tough fight that we have ahead of us, which is fighting the extradition to the United States, where we all know what awaits him? Life imprisonment, possible death sentence for the crime of publishing truthful information, for doing journalism. It's an outrage. And I'm still angry, and I'm sorry if I'm expressing it in too stronger terms, but it is. Are we seeing a total breakdown in every norms? Are we seeing a total dismissal of justice on every front, just not just national, but also international? I was observing the judge today mocking the United Nations and the finding by a respected tribunal, basically a United Nations court, who found in Julian Assange's favor. She was mocking the finding and say that it was all based on misunderstanding, and it doesn't even touch upon us. We don't have to abide by that. It doesn't really matter what the United Nations say. And the judge was echoing the words of the former foreign secretary of this country, who said exactly the same. So the United Kingdom government and the judiciary here has decided that the United Nations do not matter. You can dismiss it when it is not ruling in your favor, when it doesn't suit your political objective. At the same time, the judges and the political leadership in this country are saying, well, nobody is above the law. Julian Assange is not above the law. But who is claiming to be above international law and consensus about core values? It is the government of his country and the judiciary here. Will Julian Assange have any justice facing the extradition request by the US government in the court in this country? I doubt it, but we will fight on. We will not give up, because it's a fight about fundamental principles. It's mostly ignored by the media, the mainstream media as well, which is alarming. For the first time today, I sensed in the eyes of the many journalists I talked to, maybe an inkling of what it actually meant to them, their security, their future, their jobs, if this extradition would be allowed to go ahead. I think they are slowly getting it, and it's about time. I was just reviewing, I had to stop on my way here to read over an interview that was passed to me and with a German weekly, where I was asked, is Julian Assange a journalist or an activist? I said, well, is that a question? I mean, if you're an activist fighting for transparency, for accountability, for truth, is that activism? Well, I called it journalism. I was raised on that principle. So there's no difference in my mind. Somehow, in this distorted world that we have been led into, there's a distinction here. So what does journalism mean today to people who ask questions of that nature? Well, it's obviously not being critical to power, to hold them accountable. And I was reflecting today as well, many people were asking me, what can we do? I was actually lacking words. I would probably be better to taking advice from you. I've been in the mainstream media for 20 years. I've been with WikiLeaks for 10 years. It's my career. I've been trying to be a dedicated, honest journalist. And the values have never changed. But I'm feeling that we're coming to a juncture where things actually are breaking down totally. All the norms, everything we believe in, and the democratic principles. When Julian Assange the other day was awarded the Daphne Garcia Award by the European Parliament, one of the members of the panel said that the extradition demand by the US, this extraterritorial power, the REITs, which is taken for granted, and you mentioned, Annie, it's absurd. He said this is not attack on European democracy, our principles on this end, and it has to be fought. What can we do? Can we trust the politicians? Can we trust the judiciary? Can we trust the mainstream media? You tell me. I told people it's time probably to mobilize, to take to the streets, to actually let people know, to demand justice. We can't take this anymore. I'm emotional about this. Today is my 18th birthday of my daughter, my younger child. And I feel ashamed that I am sort of been trying for 30 years as a journalist to fight for some principles. What kind of world am I delivering to my children? I feel ashamed that I'm delivering to my children a world in a much worse place than it was. Even decades ago, even in the Nixon era. It's absurd. Daniel Ellsberg once told me, the person who leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971, he said, my God, if I had been doing this today under the secret courts, the grand juries, this fists of power crashing down everywhere, I would not see a day outside prison. I would have spent the rest of my days in prison. So we are worse off today than we were in the early 70s in the Nixon era. That is pretty chilling. That is bad. I wish I could leave you with a positive note. The only thing that I can tell you is that we will not give up. WikiLeaks will not perish. We will get Assange free. I was asked by the same journalist, will WikiLeaks be alive in 10 years? I said, well, my mother was born in 1941. At that time, there was a British Empire where the sun never set. It has diminished quite a bit. So empires have a tendency to exponentially actually diminish in power these days. We have now one empire presiding with extraterritorial reach all over the world. In 10 years, we don't know about the empire, but I would put my bet on WikiLeaks and the ideals that WikiLeaks stand for to be alive in 10 years. That's for sure. Thank you.